Today, America faces a crisis in education. The United States spends a greater portion of its gross national product on education than do France, Germany, Great Britain, Japan, Finland, even South Africa. And yet the children in all of those countries consistently outperform our own children in academic achievement. Parents feel as though they have lost control over the education of their own children. They find curriculums put in place which violate their most cherished and basic religious and moral beliefs. Today we're privileged to have 4 experts with us who will discuss some of the ways in which parents might once again gain control over the education of their own children. We look forward to discussing this with you.
Word Television Network presents the St. Charles Forum from St. Charles Borromeo Seminary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Hello and welcome to St. Charles Forum, brought to you from St. Charles Borromeo Seminary in Philadelphia. Today we're going to be discussing the crisis in education in the United States. This is a topic which is very dear to the hearts of all Christian parents, all Catholic parents. In fact, any American parent is concerned about the education of their children. Today we have 4 experts with us who will look into this problem and explore ways in which the situation might be improved. We're very privileged to have with us, immediately to my left, Donald Kimmelman, who's the Deputy Editorial Page Editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Next, we have Jamie Maguire, a Senior Fellow at the Center for Social Thought in New York City, who's published a book entitled Miracle in East Harlem, which deals with school choice in that part of New York City. Beside him, we have David Kirkpatrick, who's the Executive Director of REACH, the Road to Educational Achievement Through Choice, former public school teacher, and also former president of the Pennsylvania State Educational Association. And to his left, we have Chuck Lewis, who is with the Archdiocese of the Catholic Archdiocese of Philadelphia, working for school choice within Pennsylvania. So, gentlemen, we're very happy to have you all with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, all of us have been educated in the United States, probably have children within the schools in this country. But few of us probably have ever considered how the educational system works in this country. Maybe we can turn to a former school teacher. And could you just tell us very briefly, Dave, how we go about educating our children generally in the United States?
Well, the funding varies, of course, with every state. It's primarily a state responsibility. The present system has existed all of our lifetime, so people think it's always existed. But really, for most of the history of the United States, going back to the colonial period, it did not. It really developed in the first third of the 19th century, 1834 specifically in Pennsylvania, 1830s and 40s with Horace Mann of Massachusetts. And it developed, for the most part, there are some exceptions, for the most part, as a state-run, operated, owned system, because Horace Mann and others viewed it that way. They wanted to try to create, if you will, a standardized America, and that was a heavy period of immigration. They wanted to hope that it would standardize or bring people into the American system. And as I say, with an exception or two, they thought that was the only way it could be done. I happen to think that was a mistake, but
generally the states run the educational
institutions. It's in the state constitutions, right. There is no, in fact, there was a Supreme Court case some years ago in which the court ruled that it is not a fundamental right under the U.S. Constitution. Now, that does not mean that the federal government can't do something if they care to, but they have no obligation to, and you have no right at the national level to an education. It's in the individual state constitutions.
Well, how are our schools generally funded?
Generally funded by a mix of the state, local government with a declining proportion from the federal government for special education and certain things, handicap. Generally speaking, across the country, about 50% of the money comes from the state, about 44 or so locally, and the other 5 or 6 from the federal government. But that can vary a great deal from state to state and district to district. We have 15,000 districts, so there is no simple answer to what would happen in a given person's school district.
But Jamie, I suppose we'd have to say that the money ultimately comes from the parents of the children and other private citizens, right? Isn't it usually funded through taxes?
It's tax money, most often property tax money, and certainly, yes, coming from the parents.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, the state is collecting the money from the parents for the purpose of educating their children, And parents are faced with the increased frustration today of not seeing the education of their children going the way in which they would like to see it go.
Yeah, in principle, the state should be working for us, and as in many other areas of public life, we find that's not the case.
How local is the control usually of a school?
Well, in New York City, for example, there are 32 community school boards. This is at the elementary and middle school level, which are composed of 9 different board members, and they are responsible for selecting principals, teachers, and carrying out policy at the board level.
Mm-hmm. And I assume that's the same in Philadelphia, Don? Same system?
Well, Philadelphia has a single Board of Education for the entire city.
For the entire city.
Yeah, whereas you'll have suburban districts with just a couple thousand kids that might have their own school board and school system.
And how are the board members appointed in Philadelphia?
They're all appointed by the mayor.
Appointed by the mayor, so there's not really that much parental involvement then in Philadelphia as far as the planning of
There are kinds of political pressures that are brought to bear by various constituencies, but I'm not sure we're dying to have elected school boards because we know that can get kind of crazy as well. But at this point, the school system almost is a thing unto itself. It runs itself. The school superintendent has been there for 10 years and is probably more powerful than the school board.
So there's not really as much parental involvement or control as we might like to think there is, or should be.
You have
certainly.
parental involvement in different individual schools. You know, the more the parents are involved, the better the schools tend to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, Dave, you said it hasn't always been this way. I mean, how was it at the beginning?
Well, it's ironic in a way when people talk about the constitutional question in non-public schools, because, of course, the so-called founding fathers were all products of tutoring or non-public schools or religious schools, and yet they turned out, I think, reasonably well. The example I often give, things were in Philadelphia at the time just prior to the Revolution, the whole 13 colonies had about the same population as Philadelphia area. You can imagine this area producing a Benjamin Franklin, and a Thomas Jefferson and a George Washington, and they did that. They did not visualize at that point a public school system, even though they did believe in public schools.
Well, who was in control of education? Who educated the children back then?
Primarily it was done, if you had the wealth, it was done through private tutors or at home, or it was done in a religious setting or a religious school.
So there wasn't public education
No,
at
there
the
were a
beginning.
few public schools. Massachusetts early on said that once a community got a certain size, it should have a school. But it wasn't a system. Everybody wasn't particularly required to go to it. So there were some publicly funded schools, but they were much in the minority. A good example from our issue, because public people often cite him. Thomas Jefferson was very much interested in education. I'm talking about education, not schooling. He's often quoted saying, if you expected to be ignorant and free in a civilized world, you expect what never was and never will be. But as governor of Virginia in 1779, during the Revolution, he proposed a basic 3-year education for youngsters, so at least they were literate. He proposed funding it through the students. He did not propose a Virginia public school system. Mm-hmm. Now, it was not adapted by the legislature because of the Revolution, and frankly, Jefferson, as governor of Virginia, that was not the most successful role he had, but nonetheless, that's what he visualized, was helping kids get a good education.
Now, we're talking here about the public school system in this country, and yet the Roman Catholic Church has an interest in the education of its children, first of all, to help them get into heaven, and then to help them perform well in society at large. Chuck, is it true that the Catholic Church probably has the largest and most extensive private educational system in the country?
That's absolutely accurate. And just a point on David's point earlier, I think while it is true that the framers certainly had no hostility toward public education, I think what would be true would be a statement that said something to the effect that they would be appalled by a state monopoly system. And so I think that distinction is important because if we're examining our origins and who we are as a people, that a vibrant, healthy, competitive system would be more aligned to the framers' notion. To get to the second question, yes, the Catholic school system in the city of Philadelphia and across the state is the largest, without doubt.
Now, is this all controlled from Rome?
Absolutely. In terms of our mission, we do derive our mission statement and our modus operandi, if you will, in conjunction with the Holy Father, of course. But the actual running of the school district's quite local here with our Secretary for Education and Superintendent.
Okay, so these are really, we're talking about a system or a network of systems, I suppose I should say.
That's correct.
Because they're all run according to the geographic area of a diocese or an archdiocese, and then within that to the parishes. Right, so there's really a great deal of local control involved in Catholic education as well.
Absolutely.
John, if I may jump in on that, because as you know, my whole career is in public education. My children, my wife was a public teacher, as I was, my sister. But public education is talking about site-based management and how do we get there and how do we give more control to the schools. I have no connection with the parochial schools or other non-public, but it's true not only of parochial. Non-public schools generally across the nation have been practicing site-based management from the beginning. Very few of them are run by some kind of a system or higher structure. There may be some funding source and a little direction, but most non-public schools are largely site-based, which is why they work. They have a considerable degree of control right at the school level.
Right at the school level.
Right.
That's the important point.
And public educators, because we're such a huge system, 42 million kids, they're struggling with how do we get there? And we've got working models that go back centuries. Mm-hmm. And yet we're having a tough time thinking we can do it.
Well, so you're telling us really that what we have now in the United States is not the way it has always been, and it's not the way it necessarily has to be, that there are other approaches to the education of our children.
If I may give you one quick example, because this is, as I said, there was an exception. When they were developing the systems in the 19th century, Vermont, which then is now, was relatively a small, rural, northeastern state. The average community in Vermont has 1,800 people. When they passed the law to set up the system, they also said you don't have to follow that. If your community is small enough you think you can't afford a school, you may pay tuition and send the youngsters wherever you want. To this day, 1/3 of the communities in Vermont have no high school. Every youngster goes to a school of choice, including private schools, paid for by the local government.
The government pays to send the children to whatever school they choose to attend.
Well, with the exception, until 1961, they included religious sectarian schools, and then they dropped that. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, private schools, it's not limited to Vermont. They go to 8 other states in Canada. Last year, there was a youngster in Paris, France, who went to school paid for by the local Vermont government because his parents were there. And we're talking in much of this country of 900 or 1,000, California, I think 2,500. Vermont pays up to what they would pay for a public school. I was up there a while ago in a small community which has no high school. And they paid $7,500 tuition for youngsters to go to one non-public school, $5,500 to go to another one nearby. And it works very well.
But in other words, Vermont trusts the parents of their children to make the choice with regard to the schooling.
And they have over a century of experience to see that it works. And in the past decade or so, they have ranked among the top 5 states in the nation SAT scores, and among the top 5 states in the nation in percentage of adults in high-tech industry.
Why is it such a secret? Do you have any idea?
Well, partially because this has not really been a public issue until the last couple of years. Some of us have been at it for a long time. There was a study at the federal level way back in the early 70s. But by and large, it wasn't looked at. The idea, in fact, goes all the way back to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations in 1776. He said we should not have teachers as public employees, both for their benefit and the public, we should fund through the student. But the system grew, and once something develops, everybody thinks that's the way it is. The last 2 years, particularly, there's been increasing attention in the country, realizing that most of the other countries in the world have choice. It's emerging behind the Iron Curtain, and all of a sudden, this doesn't have to be this way. And in fact, this system doesn't work very well.
I think it's fair to say that although the history of public education in the country is relatively short, a century or so, the history of America is relatively short as a country. So certainly in anyone's memory, and their parents' memory, their grandparents' memory, public education has been the basic form of education in this country. I think 88% of the kids are in public schools. So that's what it is. You're running against a very strong tradition. Thomas Jefferson might not have gone to public school, but Bill Clinton did.
Fine. Well, we'll be back shortly to discuss some of the alternatives to public education in this country.
The St. Charles Forum will return in a moment.
Welcome back to St. Charles Forum as we discuss educational reform in the United States. A statement was made at the conclusion of our last segment that President Clinton had been educated in public schools in this country, but some clarification is needed actually, is it not? He didn't spend all of his time in public schools.
What was it? He spent a couple of years in a Catholic school?
2 years.
Yeah.
2 years. His mother did not like the public school when they moved to one community in Arkansas. She said she wouldn't have him in that school, so she sent him to a local parochial school.
And she was able to exercise choice in this area.
Right. And like is often the case, of course, they're not Catholic either.
That's right, yes. Which brings us to what is sometimes referred to as the constitutional question. Some people suggest that if there is any help coming from the government whatsoever to assist parents who are sending their children to Christian schools, Jewish schools, that this is an interference of the state in the life of the church, that it violates our constitutional separation between church and state. How much validity is there to that particular argument?
Well, as this has come up, my newspaper, the Philadelphia Inquirer, supports school vouchers. We did on a bill here in Pennsylvania. When the constitutional issue was raised, we looked at it and realized that there are good issues on both sides and decided that's one that the court should decide. Legislatures shouldn't shrink from doing this because of constitutional issues. I think it's probably a delicate issue. Depends on the composition of the court, which way they would go. There have been some decisions which seem to have held against it. At the same time, you have the GI Bill, in which people can essentially get a voucher for college and go anywhere, including this institution.
But the basic issue is that the First Amendment says that the state cannot establish a religion. Isn't that it? And so there are those who oppose assistance to church schools as the state advancing religion or advancing a particular religion.
But John, I think to be precise, what the Constitution says is that we cannot establish it. It was a phrase that I think is extremely important to our understanding. It's not freedom from religion, it's freedom of religion. And I think anybody who looks at that very closely can feel quite comfortable with an even-handed approach to help citizens of whatever religious denomination they may be.
Also, you can clearly draft a law that is unconstitutional. It's happened, and this happened twice in Pennsylvania in the 70s. But those who make the general statement that it's unconstitutional know neither the law nor the practice. The Supreme Court has consistently upheld general aid to students. And in fact, it's been estimated that nationally, 25% of the money for non-public schools already comes from public funds, for transportation, for textbooks, for special education. So it's clearly constitutional, if done right.
Now, Don mentioned the GI Bill. Why don't you just tell us what exactly the GI Bill was?
Well,
and
there's
how it
several
worked?
versions of it, but basically the GI Bill is a scholarship which the federal government gives to somebody who's been in service. I happen to use it myself.
Military service.
Military service, which you can use to go to a school of your choice. I happened to use mine at a proprietary technical school in Boston years ago, even though I later went to college and university. But what often is forgotten is that the ex-GIs, many of them entered the clergy, went to seminaries, paid for that, constitutional.
So wait a minute. They went to seminary,
Right.
and they used money that they received from the GI Bill.
There are thousands
To
of
pay
priests,
their tuition in
rabbis, and
seminary.
ministers in this country who are former GIs who got their education using the GI Bill. Now,
And no court has ever said that was unconstitutional.
no, but some will make a distinction, well, that's higher education. Well, yes and no. You see, the World War II, the first GI Bill, many of those veterans were not even high school graduates. Some of them, thousands of them, used their GI Bill and went back and got their high school diploma, including, in many cases, attending a religious high school. Nobody challenged it, and they now are out in society functioning as adults, and there was no problem.
Well, clearly the path is open before us, and what we have to do is try to pursue ways in which we can gain greater control over the use of public funds for the benefit of our children. Again, another key point here, though, is that the money is going not to a school, but rather the money is going to the family.
That's the catch.
Is that correct?
That's
Yeah,
the
to
catch. There
parents.
have been aid gone to the school. We did it in Pennsylvania twice, and the Supreme Court both times said that's unconstitutional. It went only to non-public schools. Court said you can't do that. But you can do it if you give it to the youngsters.
Now, what are some of the proposals that are out there today that could be regarded as constitutional with regard to providing more choice to the parents of school children?
Well,
what are some of the
There's one
proposals?
in Milwaukee right now which did go to court and was upheld, where they permit a small percentage of Milwaukee students, disadvantaged students, to go to other schools, including private schools, and get up to $2,500 from the state government of Wisconsin. That went to court and was upheld as constitutional.
Okay. Jamie?
The Milwaukee experiment, though, specifically was for non-sectarian
That's right.
schools.
That's right.
I think the most widely known option, and the one which has been practiced most successfully, is the concept of public school choice, which had its birth in East Harlem in the early 70s, when that school district was at the bottom of the barrel of New York City school districts. Once a network of alternative schools was allowed to function and the parents and kids could choose among them, immense improvements began to take place. And by 1987, District 4 had risen from 32 out of 32 to 15 out of 32 in New York City, and it has improved in the last 20 years more than any other school district in New York City.
So there are a number of schools within that district, is that correct?
That's right. There are 26 different middle schools from which parents and kids can choose.
I see.
but it's by no means the only choice system in public education. Montclair, New Jersey, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Rochester, New York are other examples, and today we see this phenomenon spreading rapidly across the country.
Now, you've just written a book on the East Harlem proposal, or not proposal, but experiment. I mean, it's been working, right?
It's worked very well, and it's spreading in New York City across Central Park to District 3 on the west side, and in 6 other districts there are elements of choice working. Chancellor Fernandez, before his contract expired, actually blessed the creation of 37 different new theme high schools, all of which would be choice schools. So New York is on the bandwagon now, and we're seeing people around the country and indeed from other countries coming to see what was happening there.
And in East Harlem, there are very clear indications that there was academic improvement among the children in that school district.
When East Harlem began its network of alternative schools and choice in '73, only 16% of the kids were reading at their grade level. By 1987, that was up to 65%.
Wow, that's remarkable.
Mm-hmm. And also, Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard University is one of the, if not the leading expert on the First Amendment. And he's not particularly a supporter of choice, especially for non-public schools. But he was quoted more than a year ago in the New York Times as saying you'd have to be pretty inept to draft a choice bill that would not be acceptable to the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. In other words, it could be done, but only if you're careless.
Right.
So I always had one question about East Harlem. Its success has been known for a lot of years now. It's always the most successful choice system that students from all around the country point to. Why has it been so slow to spread in New York City? If you have something that's working and you have all these other districts where it's not working, why haven't they moved faster to try to do something similar elsewhere?
The Central Board of Education in New York City has 6,000 employees. The very notion of a success like District 4 was extremely unsettling to them. Our system rewards failure. Bureaucracies exist to perpetuate themselves, and local initiative is something which a central bureaucracy will try to stamp out. So there's a great conflict between change at the local level and that which the bureaucracy will tolerate.
Okay, now with this experiment though, this was just choice among public schools.
It was.
And obviously Christian parents, Jewish parents are going to be interested in choices of schools within their own religious denomination. What are some approaches that could be, that could survive, let's say, a constitutional test and would provide choice outside the public schools?
Well, I think the next step, and one which Minnesota and California are beginning to experiment with, is the concept of charter schools. Charter schools are schools which can be created by groups of teachers, by local communities, by a college, a university, a corporation, and yet they meet state requirements, and they are entitled to state funding, yet they are not controlled by a central school board of any kind.
So they're like private schools, but they receive public funding. Is that right?
It's like an independent public school.
It's like an independent public school.
Yeah.
I believe Pennsylvania has provision for this in its bill.
That's right. There could be 5 certified teachers plus a group of parents make a proposal to the if this law passes, propose to the Secretary of Education that they set up a charter school, and if he approves it, they have to say what they want to do. There's certain requirements to be met. But if he approves it, they can be chartered for up to 5 years, can thereafter be renewed as long as they remain accredited.
Well, could a group of Catholic parents get together and set up a charter school?
They could, as long as they were not directly tied to a sectarian institution.
In other words, if they weren't owned by the Archdiocese,
that's right.
let's say.
That's right.
So
I mean, the 5 teachers could be Catholic.
Sure.
As many public teachers are anyway. No, it says 5 certified teachers plus the parents to indicate what they plan to do, a tentative budget for 3 years, what the initial faculty may be, and if the secretary finds that permissible and charters them, they're off and running.
So you could have administrators, faculty members, students who had their lives formed and shaped by their Catholic beliefs, attending this school, and as long as it wasn't under the control, if you will, of the local bishop or a religious order, that conceivably it could be receiving public funding.
As a matter of fact, the states that have already done this, Minnesota and California, and the proposed legislation in Pennsylvania would do the same thing. Say, once you are approved, other than meeting the needs of health and safety, and meeting any court order for desegregation, so you can't have a separated school, once you're approved, you're free from all the other normal curriculum and regulations
Well, that's a real exciting possibility for the
And John,
future.
let me just say that while from our part at the Archdiocese that we would welcome these kinds of hybrid public schools as a definite improvement on the quality of the product that we're getting now. These still don't address the fundamental justice issue, which is that a parent has the primary obligation to educate his or her child. And in exercising that right, they shouldn't be economically penalized for doing so. And so these schools, while definitely would be an improvement, it still doesn't address the fundamental rights of parents.
So you're saying parents should still be able to send their children to an archdiocesan high school
Right.
and receive some assistance from the government to do so?
They should not be penalized for exercising their primary obligation.
Before we leave charter schools, I think the appeal of charter school is twofold. First of all, you get around that issue of giving money to private schools. It's easier to do politically. And second of all, because they are independent public schools, instead of getting a voucher of $900 or $1,000 or whatever it is, you get everything. You get the same $6,000 for your student at that school as you would get to have them in the bureaucratized public school. The downside is that you have to form new schools. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do. And so I think that even if you create charter school laws, it's going to take a long, long time before there are enough charter schools that you'll really have any meaningful impact.
And for people who are concerned about the increasing cost of doing education, if you will, that really doesn't address their concerns, because exactly as Don mentioned, what you're forced to do is go into the construction business again.
Okay, well, we're going to look into some more possibilities when we come back in the next segment.
The St. Charles Forum will continue in a moment.
Welcome back to St. Charles Forum as we discuss educational reform in the United States. As we finished the last segment, we were talking about something known as charter schools, which are publicly funded, if you will, private schools. And we saw this as an exciting possibility for parents, but there are some drawbacks to this and some restrictions. I think, David, you had mentioned one right at the end.
The initial one to start with, because they want to see if these work, is Minnesota, which has 700,000 public school youngsters, only authorizes 8 such schools. California authorizes 100. But of course, California is much bigger than Minnesota. The Pennsylvania legislation would authorize 50, which is a start. I think it's worthwhile, and it's already showing promise. In Minnesota, we're a couple in operation. But the idea that even if this becomes law in several states, options will open up for youngsters all over is simply not possible because there aren't enough schools.
So we've already discussed 2 possibilities now, and that is choice within public schools and these charter schools. There's also something called tuition tax credits. How does that work, and is that really much of an option?
Well, the basic idea is if you pay, let's say, $700 tuition to go to a non-public school, you're a youngster, you could deduct the $700 directly off your taxes. That was considerably talked about 10 years ago. There's much less talk about it now.
Well, wouldn't that be pretty advantageous? I mean, you would be paying
Well, for those who
less
pay enough in
and-
taxes, the problem is that a lot of people don't pay that much in taxes, and poor people may have several children, which they can't afford. One answer originally to that was, well, let's have a negative tax credit then. If you don't pay, if you have 3 youngsters and you don't pay $2,000 in taxes, send the youngster to school, we'll give you the $2,000 back when they complete the year. But they discovered that doesn't work either, because now you got a cash flow. If you're really poor, how do you come up with $2,000 in September and then wait till June to get it back? So the emphasis has now been on the voucher or the scholarship proposal, which is, is all over in higher education, works very well.
Okay, that's called the voucher system. Did you call it something else then?
Well, I call it scholarship, and also a term that we used that former President George Bush picked up, because it's really what it is. We call it here in this state a GI Bill for kids.
A GI Bill for kids.
Right.
Now, of the 4 experts sitting here, do you all see that as probably the best option today for opening new opportunities for the children in this country? What about has the Philadelphia Inquirer taken a position on this?
Yeah, we're for all of them.
You're for all of them.
Yeah, and I don't think they contradict each other. You can support more choice within public schools, you can support charter schools, and you can support vouchers. What vouchers do, and particularly if they're means tested, which we support, and that's an argument as to at what income level do you no longer get the voucher because you can afford to do it anyway, that it just allows people who might not, whose kids are trapped in a bad public school to send them to perhaps a parochial school or an independent private school, and where there isn't a good public school that's close enough for them to do it that way.
Now, you just used a very loaded word from my point of view. You said when there's no choice there, the children are trapped, right? So, I mean, without opening up some kind of possibility for parents, their children can actually be trapped in a detrimental situation, right?
That's
It's the only area
or institution in this country where we find ourselves so situated. We can buy our groceries where we want, we can go to the doctor we want, we can live where we want, and yet most kids today are consigned to the public school that is closest to them for no particular reason, regardless of whether it fits with their needs and abilities.
That's right, John. I'm sorry, David.
The phrase I've used, John, which I've seen some media pick up, is the U.S. Supreme Court in 1925 ruled unanimously that no child in America can be compelled to go to any particular school. So you've got a constitutional right. The thing is, how do you express it if you don't have the funds? Anybody who has the funds either to go to a non-public school, or as a recent survey showed, 53% of public school parents are where they are because they want their kid in that school, you have the option. And what I've argued is that, particularly in urban schools, they've got to be more than economic prisons for the poor, which is what they are right now.
So in other words, there's an economic coercion requiring parents to send their children
legally,
to a
you
certain
cannot
school.
compel
Legally,
it.
you can't compel
So we
it.
do it economically.
We're doing it economically. That's a good point.
And from our perspective, we feel that we don't have to reinvent the wheel on this, that the GI Bill for kids has already been tried and tested. And as Jamie mentioned, you know, when you get your food stamp, you don't have to go to a government-run Acme or ShopRite or Giant or whatever. And the reality of it is, when you empower people with that voucher, that's when you have true accountability, true reform, and that's what we're talking about. It's the crux of the issue here.
Now, I'm interested in the mechanics of this. How exactly does a voucher system work?
It basically worked the way the GI Bill does, and that is you wouldn't give the money directly to the parent or the child. You give them, in effect, a voucher, a certificate, a scholarship, whatever you want to call it, and they enroll in a school. The school then demonstrates that the youngster is, in fact, in attendance and performing satisfactorily. The Pennsylvania bill would only require 15 days. 15 days after school is started, the school would certify that the youngster is there, and then the certificate is redeemed.
When you say the certificate is redeemed, that means the parent gives the certificate to the school, the child is then enrolled in that school, and the school takes it and cashes it in with the government.
That's right.
Is that it?
That's right.
Now, can the voucher be used for a child to go to a public school as well?
Yes, ours calls for public intra-district, which is legal right now, but a lot of districts don't do it. We would mandate it. You'd have to have in Philadelphia, for example, or any district with multiple schools. The youngster would have a choice of which elementary school, let's say, they went to, space available. It also calls for inter-district choices, which is what they have in Minnesota and Arkansas, where Governor Clinton, then Governor Clinton,
was going to a school even outside your
any
school
place
district.
in the state, any public school. Then we have the non-public and private schools included as well. But ours is inclusive. You'd have a total choice of any school, public or private.
I think it most effectively, again, represents the, and I think respects the parent's right, again, for that primary obligation and the exercise thereof.
Now, how many states have a voucher system now?
As a voucher system inclusive, none really, but there are 14 that have the public school choice now. And there's some like the Milwaukee, which has a limited local choice, and Vermont, as I say, has had it for a long time, including private non-sectarian schools.
There are probably a dozen of privately funded voucher programs which have sprung up around the country. Which
So this is another approach, privately
marvelous
funded vouchers.
initiatives being taken by industry and concerned citizens to try to escape the tyranny of failed inner city schools. The crucial thing about being able to choose your own school, whether you're a parent, a student, or a teacher, is when you can go to the school where you want to be, where you want to work, or where you want to learn, you have a sense of ownership. When you have that sense of ownership, you're going to do well.
Now, if you have this privately funded voucher, how does that work? A nonprofit institution is set up that collects monies from donors? Is that the way it works?
That's the way it's working in Indianapolis now. The Golden Rule Insurance Company has been the godfather of the program there. People contribute in. There's another wonderful program in New York called the Student Sponsor Partnership, where about 700 young professionals act as mentors and help to pay the tuition costs of high school students who are attending non-public high schools.
So the private voucher fund, if you will, simply makes these vouchers available to children who apply to it, to go to whatever school they want, including religious schools.
The circumstances differ from city to city, but certainly religious schools can be included.
With regard to the idea, there would be no restriction on that.
Basically, yes, because it's private money, so there's no question. May I also go back to tuition tax credits? That's not used, but Minnesota has had an income credit for about 40 years now, several $100s at the elementary level and even more at the secondary, available to every student, public or private. That did go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said that's constitutional.
It is constitutional.
In fact, no state has a voucher system at this point suggests correctly that it's a big political hurdle to overcome. Of all the different options that we've talked about, this is the tough one. And you're going up against some very strong vested interests. The most important, of course, are the public school teachers unions, which are very politically active and which are quite effective at fighting these programs, and the public is sufficiently divided that they seem to win.
Well, I think the public doesn't know the facts. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest problems.
Neither do most public educators, may I add.
Wouldn't it be frightfully expensive, though, to go into a voucher system? I mean, wouldn't the cost of education increase tremendously if somebody wanted to use a voucher to go to
No, not necessarily.
You've been reading
Sidwell
that public,
Friends?
Yeah.
You've been reading the union literature.
I was going to say the most expensive in terms of paying the highest tuition is Vermont. It's 150 years old, no problem. They don't pay more than a public school, but up to. But most of the others is $2,500 or less. An initiative will be on California ballot next year. So it's less expensive, not more.
That's
It's
right,
less
John, and we're
expensive?
talking about such a small part of the education budget, not only in this state, but in other states. And we have to look at the total cost to society. We talked about private initiatives, businessmen getting together organized to give kids vouchers. Well, is it altruism? And I don't mean to minimize their altruistic nature, but it's good business sense, because today when applicants come in for job interviews, they have to fill those things out right there, because what's happening, they're leaving and having other people fill them out.
Because they can't read and write.
That's correct. And business now has gotten a wake-up call in the 70s and 80s. And we talk about total costs. Sure, initially we have to spend $1 to save 3 or 4, but look at what it costs to graduate somebody from the nation's prison system in relation to what we should be spending on the education of those individuals.
And furthermore, look at the enormous amounts of money we've spent trying to improve our educational system, which have gotten us nothing. From 1980 to 1985, we increased our educational expenditures by 40%. If we found something which really works, and we think Choice does, that would be money well spent.
We're close to a high school right now where we're seated that spends over $7,000 per pupil and has an 80% dropout rate. I can think of a district in another state, other than Pennsylvania, that spends over $10,000 per pupil, a public school district, urban district, and the dropout rate for the district is 65%. So what are we getting for the money? The kids lose, the morale of the teachers in those schools.
So it's not necessarily just the expenditure of funds.
No.
I mean, with the 40% increase from 1980 to 1985, scholastic aptitude test scores dropped, didn't
Drop
they?
like a stone.
Yeah, let me add that I don't always agree with taxpayers groups. I mean, you do need money. You can't run a school for nothing. But the point we're making is that money by itself won't do it either. Sometimes considerable amounts of money.
Are
will not do it.
you telling us, though, that it won't cost the state overall more money if it's going to provide vouchers for
Yes,
for
I
the
think
children?
that argument has to be made. In the state of Pennsylvania alone, we nearly had 580,000 non-public school students in this state, and today we have about 280,000. And you don't, again, have to be a math major to figure out the arithmetic there. The reality of it is we do it more efficiently and cheaper.
Now, when you say we, you're speaking as a Catholic here,
That's
right?
correct, absolutely.
So you're able to educate the children for less.
Right, but I also, if I may, during this program, represent the non-public school sector. The non-public school sector does it more efficiently and cheaper.
But when you say, how much will vouchers cost, how expensive it will be, it really depends on how you write the law. And where we might have some disagreements around here is whether you means test it, whether you make vouchers available to everyone, or whether you make vouchers available to poor, working class, lower middle class. Where are you going to draw the line? The higher you draw the line, the more it's going to cost. One of the criticisms of the voucher bill here in Pennsylvania that was used against it is they figured it would cost $300 million just to pay for the kids who are already in parochial schools to go to the same schools they're going to. That's a good argument for an opponent to use. The more you means test that voucher, the more you take that argument away from them.
When you say the more you means test it, you mean you place restrictions on income.
Put an income restriction on it. And I know in Illinois now, where they're debating a voucher bill, they've made it a pilot program for inner city kids. Just go right at the population that needs it most, and take away that argument of the opponents.
And
Good.
Don,
Well, we're gonna have to break now, and we'll get back into this discussion in a few minutes.
Stay tuned. The St. Charles Forum will return in just a moment.
back to St. Charles Forum as we discuss some of the exciting possibilities and proposals for opening up the educational system in this country so that parents can once again take over control of the education of their own children. Right at the end of the last segment, Don Kimmelman of the Philadelphia Inquirer had said that we really ought to go right into the inner city with these programs where parents are desperate to improve the condition of their children. Why is it that we don't seem to have more support for these proposals from the inner city?
I think the political reality is that inner city politicians tend to be Democrats. The Democrats are very closely linked to the public teachers unions, which oppose school choice in general, but particularly any kind of voucher program. I also think that in a city like Philadelphia, the inner city politicians who are not poor themselves are thinking more in terms of what it's going to do to their constituents who are bureaucrats in the school system, their constituents who are teaching in the school system, who are teachers' aides, who are bus aides. There's a whole kind of black middle class in Philadelphia that lives off the public school system. So they're thinking more of the employees of the system, I think, than they are of the students.
Mm-hmm. And so you're not saying that it's necessarily the parents who are not supporting this, but rather the vested interests and the bureaucracies and the establishment rather than the parents themselves.
Yeah, I just think that the parents have not galvanized for it, so they're really not a force.
When polled, in any number of polls, both in this part of the country and nationally, black parents show and minority parents show, if anything, a larger percentage in favor of choice. Mm-hmm. So there's no question.
It makes sense that they've got the lousier schools.
Polls directed to the parents
There
themselves.
was one a year ago in Philadelphia on our pending legislation at that time by a Temple University professor found 56% of the public in favor of our choice legislation, 62% of minorities. There's also another factor, which is totally separate from education, but the poor and the disadvantaged are powerless by definition almost, and they also tend to be alienated from the system. I know I've worked in voter registration campaigns in the past, and you would think if somebody who was unemployed, lost their job, would be the first one to sign up. They tend to be the last. They get discouraged and they give up. So an elected politician, obviously, whatever his or her qualities may be, reacts to those who are in the system who are making a difference in the election. And the poor tend not to count.
I'll tell you, I can substantiate in the city of Philadelphia, we are absolutely sitting on a groundswell of support among parents. With very little publicity in some sectors of the community, we have turned out 200, 300 people at a meeting, and they're angry. They're angry. They're not satisfied with the education that their children are receiving, and they feel completely trapped, and they want to change. And I would just wholeheartedly agree with what Don Kimmelman said, and that's where you have a variance between what the elected officials are saying and doing and what the parents are requiring and requesting. And that's that mindset. We're running smack up against the mindset of those unions, that it's the system first, the system last, always the system. And there's that status quo mentality that just has such a lack of imagination on this issue.
Well, one thing I must say that I fear somewhat as a Catholic parent, and that is that if we accept aid from the state in any form, I mean, even to the point of vouchers, that they will begin to intrude into the schools and they will begin to interfere with the religious and moral education of our children. Isn't that a danger of the voucher system?
I think theoretically, so somebody once said at a meeting I was at recently, that opponents of a new idea go around and say, what if, spreading fear and doubt. As I indicated earlier, in the first place, 25% of the money for non-public schools, religious and independent, already comes from public sources. So if they want to use that as an argument to put a club on your head, they can do it right now. It's also, and the tendency's been in the reverse, to even try to do less of that. But also you can put it in the legislation, as we have done in Pennsylvania, that beyond the health and safety and to meet a segregation order of the court, any schools, including the charter schools that would be set up under our legislation or aided through the voucher, they cannot place any additional burdens on them than they already have.
Okay, but what you're saying just on that point is that the bill that you have before the Pennsylvania legislature, which is similar to voucher bills across the country.
And we've looked at many others, yes.
That's right. Says that the state can only require things that have to do with the health and safety of the children, and they have to support any kind of desegregation order. Right. In other words, they can't use private schools as a way to segregate or to act against minorities. Right. And that's all the further that the public schools can...
Of course, the classic example again is the GI Bill. You've had over 20 million veterans eligible, and most have used it. Now, the federal government does put some regulation on college and university, no question, but that has nothing to do with the GI Bill. They're doing that generally for other purposes. The GI Bill is run very simply with an office out of the Veterans Administration, certifies you're eligible, certifies you're in the school, and then pays the school for your attendance. Mm-hmm.
Plus, I think if we look at reality here, the government isn't interested in getting into that business. Again, we get back to the analogy, which I think holds true with the food stamps. They're not running around trying to run supermarkets across this country. They're not going to be getting into the private school business. And
no,
in fact,
but let me say, and let's be very honest, that there are certain movements in the United States today that are trying to push their agendas, and they're agendas that don't conform to the religious beliefs of most Jews and Christians. And I'll say, for example, the active homosexual movement that will say, well, unless you teach that homosexuality is a lifestyle that's as normal and as legitimate as a married heterosexual lifestyle, that you can no longer receive this government funding. I mean, isn't that a danger?
Again, let's come back to the precedent of the GI Bill. People went to this very seminary on the GI Bill. We've done it before, we can do it again. Again, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And I think what we're addressing here really is the PR aspect of the teachers' unions who want to scare people into maintaining the status quo. And I think that's what we have.
You always have, in a society of 250 million people, somebody's always promoting something. The thing is what actually happens. Matter of fact, charter schools are recent. The first one was passed in Minnesota a couple of years ago, and they just signed one in California last September, Governor Pete Wilson. In both cases, those laws say that once you meet the health and safety and so forth, all other state regulations are waived, not added to. I mean, not only don't add those kind of regulations, you don't even have the curriculum requirements anymore, and some of the other requirements we have right now.
So you don't even have to worry about certification, let's say, of the teachers.
Well, in Minnesota, yes, but in California, no.
Okay, so it depends.
He said, yeah, you don't need to be certified.
Do with an individual state.
And getting back to that fundamental justice issue again, I'm a Catholic, but I'm a taxpayer too, and I pay taxes just like everyone else. And that, I think, again, gets back to that fear tactic that they use. And again, it's been effective here in the state of Pennsylvania. They've used it. They've instilled that fear. But I don't think in a second that I, for one, would not be advocating school choice if I thought that was going to be the result.
Sure. Yeah, you're a parent after all. I'd just like to make a point for the sake of the viewing audience, and that is the fact that we have Chuck Lewis here, representing the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. Obviously, I'm a Catholic parent as a professor of moral theology in a Catholic seminary, but the other members of the panel today are not Catholic and certainly not approaching this from a Catholic perspective. I mean, well, why don't you tell me what your primary concerns are with the Philadelphia Inquirer, for example?
Well, the Inquirer, the way we arrived at school vouchers, and I think it was a little surprising to a lot of people for basically an establishment, liberal newspaper to come out for vouchers. And we came at it very pragmatically, and particularly looking at the state of education in Philadelphia and worrying about kids who clearly aren't getting an education for whatever reason. And we realize there are tremendous socioeconomic causes that go beyond anything schools can do. But looking just purely at education, the way I came at it personally, I can tell you, was working on a column one day, and I was in a poor black neighborhood and was talking to some people, and the local parochial school let out and saw all these basically poor inner city kids walking out of the school, and the girls in their little plaid jumpers and the boys in their ties, and a couple of priests kind of walking among them, white priests, everyone sort of milling around. It was like Going My Way or something updated, and talking to one of the parents and saying, one of the women on the block saying, well, who goes to the parochial school, who goes to the private school? And she said, well, basically, the Catholic kids go to the parochial school. And I said, come on, there aren't that many Catholic kids here. She said, all right, the ones who can afford it send their kids to the parochial school because the public schools are so, the discipline is so bad, the kids aren't getting an education. And I should know because I teach in the public schools.
She said this.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And so, and when the tests came out, there used to be a certain statewide test that both the Catholic school kids took and the public school kids took. And when they did comparisons, they found that the inner city Catholic school kids were doing better than the public school kids citywide, including kids from middle and upper middle class neighborhoods.
So as a Philadelphian, you're just concerned about the educational
the Catholic kids, they're educating these kids and they're doing it cheaper.
Doing it for less than they're doing it better.
And we should let as many kids as possible have the advantage of it.
Well, we've now heard from a liberal East Coast newspaper on that, so we could be kind of excited. Jamie, you're from a East Coast city too, New York City, Center for Social Thought.
I am. I actually first got interested in education tutoring inner city kids at Baltimore while an undergraduate, and I subsequently taught at college and then was involved in teaching and education in the Peace Corps in Thailand and later in Central Africa. So I'm now a fellow at a think tank called the Center for Social Thought, and our concern is really to build up those things which will strengthen society. And like you, Don, I have come to the conclusion that Public school choice will do that.
You're saying this will improve the public schools as well. Is that one of the things you're saying?
I'm saying that charter schools will do that. I'm all in favor of people exercising their right to private education, and I think there's a very good argument to be made for the logic of a multiple approach to strengthen not only parochial schools, but all education. And I think that will act as a healthy discipline on the public school system. And the public school system is not going away. It educates 88% of our school children. It'll be with us for a long time.
And Dave?
That's why I am for it. I think it will be the salvation of public education. The present system does not work well, as John Chubb and Terry Moe have said.
And you're a former public school teacher.
I spent my whole career in the public school.
And
you
think this
go
will
back
help?
to my preschool, and I started before kindergarten. I spent almost 60 years in the public system.
Okay.
And by and large, it does not work well. Even where it's thought to work well, it works well because it's an advantaged district with advantaged students. It's not the system. My book, which I wrote, is dedicated to public school teachers who know there's a better way.
Okay, David has a book called Choice in Schooling.
Right. When that came out, I have a classmate of mine I went to college with back in the 50s, and she's a public school teacher in Connecticut. She wrote me a letter, said, I bought your book, and I remember you talking about this when we were in college. I think, because we have choice. As you have in higher education, if you have money flowing scholarships through students, it's not just the students and parents that have choice. The teachers have choice. And we're now accountable directly to the students and parents, and as long as we can satisfy them, we'll have leeway to run the school the way we think it should be run, not the way that the best intentioned people in the world in Harrisburg and Washington try to tell us it should be run, which clearly is not successful. In Harrisburg,
Parents and teachers will have choice.
Teachers
and you
will
see
have
this
choice.
as helping to save the public school system, and Chuck, you see this as helping to save the parochial school
Yes,
system
and I believe
as well.
very strongly that our mission-oriented Catholic school system has always made a positive contribution to civil society. And we're just delighted that other community leaders, not just from our camp, if you will, have come to the same conclusions.
Well, this is very exciting, and we see here an issue on which we can join forces for the sake of the children. And clearly for us as Catholic parents who may be watching this show, the primary concern is to make sure that our children get into heaven. And one way they can be helped along that road is by going to a Catholic school. But they also have to become effective members of society. And as we increase the educational opportunities for them, we believe that all of these goals can be met. So, gentlemen, we thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
For more information on the issues addressed in this edition of the St. Charles Forum, you may wish to contact the following: The Reach Alliance, Post Office Box 1283, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania 17108 1283. Or the Center for Social Thought, 37 West 20th Street, Suite 902, New York, New York 10011. Or you may also wish to contact the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights, 5735 Rising Sun Avenue, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania 19120.